This is Teachers Talk Radio.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs. This week my guest is Professor Mordecai Gordon of Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, USA. He's a writer and lecturer in education, and we discuss the importance of uncertainty and doubt.
This is Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in at ttradio.org. Download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in with Teachers Talk Radio.
And we're back with my guest, Professor Mordecai Gordon of Quinnipiac University in the beautiful state of Connecticut. And as we're recording this, there's a most tremendous heat wave going on in the United States. And Professor, are you experiencing this?
Not as intense as the South, but a lot of we're experiencing high humidity. So it's very humid and kind of air is heavy.
I have experienced a Chicago summer, so I know something of what they used to call 100% humidity, which I wouldn't have thought was even possible.
That's right. That's it.
Surely that's underwater.
Right. That's it. 100%. Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining me on this show. And my listeners will know that what I'm doing is exploring, after 38 years or so of teaching, what exactly I was up to. And I mean that in a sense that I think I'm not entirely clear that was I doing good or ill? And I don't mean that in a terribly depressive sense, but I think teaching is problematic. And I think for me, I'm reflecting on what we do in teaching and the uncertainty I feel about that. And one of the things that struck me initially was when I saw from the things you've written, one of the things you wrote a few years ago now, I think it's 2005, was on myths in American education. And it struck me that's such a good place to start, because over my career, I've seen a number of fads and myths and ideas about education sort of come and go. And I'm wondering if teaching is just a place that's rather easily beset with beliefs that seem so fixed and then pass. So what led you to myths in American education?
Great place to start. I had been a professor of teacher education for a number of years. I started at Brooklyn College, and then before transferring to Quinnipiac University for a tenure-track job. But I was working with in-service and pre-service teacher candidates, teaching the Foundations of Education course each year and sometimes each semester. And I noticed over the years that they had these kinds of misconceptions and myths about teaching. At the time, I was living in White Plains, New York, and taking the train and the subway to the Brooklyn College. And I had time, and I sat there in the subway, I think, and started taking notes, jotting down some of the more common misconceptions that my teacher candidates had. Eventually came up with 10, as you mentioned a minute ago, the fads that people, because education is a field that goes through kind of like a pendulum and fads. And so, for example, that theory and practice have no relationship, that they're like these two very different things. That's one. That a good classroom is a quiet classroom is another. That multiculturalism that you meant is only about teaching heroes and holidays. That more testing means better education.
Did you have to bring yourself to stop at 10, or did you think I could keep on going here? There are so many things we believe that have just been embedded. And
to be perfectly honest, 10 sounds good. 10 common myths. And I even had a colleague of mine. He made a joke about it. He would come to my office and ask, "Why 10?" And he accused me of plagiarizing from Moses from the Ten Commandments. So, in a kind of jovial kind of, obviously, but it just, I stopped at some point. Right, you're absolutely right. I could have gone on and found more, but it made sense to stop. These were the common ones that I could think about that I was kind of encountering in my teaching.
And what about, say, one of the themes that seems to come through some of the things you've written about, for instance, existential philosophy and so on? I mean, you take a very philosophical approach to thinking about teaching, which is, I think, fundamental to thoughts about what it is we do. But that doubt and uncertainty are actually not. You can embrace those things, and if a student says, well, I'm not really certain where this is going, or I feel at a loss, there seems to be I can't reconcile different views in this lesson, or something of that kind, that actually is not that can be creative and positive. It doesn't have to be a bad thing at all.
Yeah, I've always felt that's a great point, John. I've always felt that way. To your point, that there's a value in having students kind of struggle with something initially, and kind of not understand it immediately, and then come after some kind of struggles, or work through those struggles and reach the insights that you want them to reach, not necessarily immediately, but going through a journey. And we can trace that back to Socrates and Plato, with the dialogues when we see how Socrates' interlocutors, the people that he dialogued with, debated with, would often kind of become confused, and he would come sometimes even discouraged, and Socrates would have to um, take them on a journey of working through those confusions till eventually getting a little bit more clarity and understanding. So I'm the kind of educator that, and even in the way that I create my syllabus, or I don't give students I know colleagues that have 15, 20-page syllabi because they want the students to know everything in advance and everything. I'm not that kind of educator. I want things to kind of, in the course of the semester, to kind of unfold and become clear, and not necessarily give everything away at the outset.
Do you ever say to students that it may be possible that I'll also learn something here? That sometimes during a lesson, I know I've experienced that, where you think a student, not just a student, a rather clever student, because they often are very clever, will say things that you yourself go, well, I've never thought of it that way. I'll have to think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, I value that. I want that. I want them to kind of challenge me with questions, that, and not questions about how long does the midterm paper need to be, or what font, not those kinds of questions, but questions about content, questions about questions where they challenge ideas, that in my own perspective. Yes, so absolutely, that's the real fun of teaching, and the real kind of challenge of teaching.
I was thinking, as you mentioned, kind of Socratic dialogues, and the idea that one question that I doubt Socrates ever faced from his students was, "Is this in the test?" And that kind of idea that I hope it isn't true, but I feel it might be, that during my teaching career there was an increasing data-driven kind of instrumentalism. The things we teach must be measurable. It came
Right.
from two directions. It came from the students themselves. They wanted to know the outcomes. Am I going to pass the test? But also it came from the school, which we have to measure what schools are. We have to measure what lessons successful are. So there has to be something we can pin down that's measurable on a spreadsheet and so on. Well, that doesn't leave a lot of room for uncertainty.
Right. And not only that, and I agree with you that the pressure comes from different sources, from the here in the United States, also from the students, but from the district, from the states, and from even federal legislation that we had in the United States, like No Child Left Behind in the early 2000s and things. But it's not only that doesn't leave room for uncertainty, but one could make a very good case that some of the most important things that we want students to learn and develop cannot be measured numerically easily, like developing good character, like becoming more critical thinkers, like empathy, you mentioned creativity before, all those things that we really thinking outside of the box, those are things that are much more difficult to measure. So in a kind of numerical accurate kind of way. So when we ultimately, I'll say it this way, because I say this to my students, it's a very important education is really about hinges on very few questions. One of them is, what do we emphasize? What are we going to choose to emphasize, and what are we going to de-emphasize? And so so your point about testing and measurement kind of goes to that question. When we put so much emphasis on testing and measurement, the byproduct of that, the sad, is that we de-emphasize really the things that are much more important that I just mentioned, like creativity, critical thinking, good character, kind of becoming informed and critical citizens in a democratic society. So that's the point that we need to keep in mind.
Teaching is a rewarding profession, but it comes with its fair share of challenges. That's where ADAPT come in. We're not your typical trade union, but instead a modern, apolitical alternative, offering expert legal, employment and mental health support. Protection without the politics. So what makes ADAPT different? We're always apolitical and independent, specialised solely in supporting individual teachers. Our caseworkers are professionally qualified, ensuring you always get the best advice. Plus, there's 24/7 mental health support. Whether it's a simple contract check or handling serious allegations, ADAPT are here for you. Join the thousands of educators who've chosen ADAPT to protect their careers. Subscribe at adapt.org.uk today. ADAPT. Supporting school staff. Protecting careers.
You're listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs. My guest this week, Professor Mordecai Gordon, author, lecturer and teacher of education at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, USA. We're discussing why teachers should not be afraid of uncertainty. Before the break, Professor Gordon, you said something which struck me as a concern in teaching, that we are trying to create creative, we're trying to develop creative, thoughtful, critically thinking students. At the same time, much of our education is dominated by systems of testing and examining, in which we have to find ways of defining knowledge with very clear boundaries. This is the thing you should know, and so on. And if any system of testing, and Britain is a very examined, we're not the worst in the world, but we have a lot of exams. Students sit exams in their early years in school, their SATs tests. They'll also sit GCSEs or general certificates. They'll sit A-levels and so on. So we do an awful lot of testing, and that tends to wag the dog. I mean, if you know there's a test at the end of anything, then the thing that you are going to teach becomes prioritized
Right.
towards it. If it's in the test, it's important. If it's not in the test, it's not important.
Correct.
So that gives a sort of hierarchy of knowledge.
Correct.
And indeed, students will ask, "Is this in the test?" And sometimes
Right.
you have to say, "Well, no, not really."
Right, but it's still important. It's not on the and teaching. It's not obviously it's not only in the UK. It's very prominent here in the United States of teachers spending weeks and months teaching students to preparing them for the test. And again, that has um, a, some negative consequences. So now, for example, narrowing down of the curriculum because you only have so much time in the day, and you have to. So if you're and the testing in the United States, at least at the beginning of the 20th century, was focused primarily on language arts, reading, right, and math. And so one of the byproducts of that heavy emphasis on that kind of testing in public schools is that other subjects like social studies, history, civics, art, music received very little attention.
Mm. Yeah, it does. It sort of again establishes those things we think are worth knowing, and also a tendency to try to break down those more open-ended things, those creative arts, into things you can measure. I was talking to a teacher who's a lecturer in drama education, and I said, well, in this country we have a GCSE in drama. And I can remember briefly being involved in assessing this. Now you'd walk around the room and you try to assess students in their ability to share ideas or communicate with others or cooperate in a group. And I think, well, I've invented a means of assessing students in being human. I've simply constructed a series of ways in which you can fail to communicate effectively or fail to share things effectively. So maybe a good drama student was something you say, well, I know you're a good drama student, but I can't tell you why. There's a slight mystery to it.
Yeah, or what I would add to what you just said, in the case of drama or dance or the art, we can view how they perform. We don't measure it, but we can see how somebody performs over time. And kind of like creating a portfolio of performance. So if it's a painter, they're going to submit a portfolio of their work, or if it's a musician, they're going to kind of record or perform. So yeah, and that's very different from the kind of testing that you were talking about before. That really, that kind of testing, the standardized testing, measures what a person knows in a specific moment in time, or what they can recall, and that's very different from the kind of performance of theater actors or musicians that have to kind of practice a long time and develop a craft that they can kind of hone and share with others. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I'm trying. We're having more of a conversation. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I think it is difficult to know that is at the heart of what we do. You're uncertain as to whether you're the instructor or whether you're the facilitator, whether you are someone who is allowing people to develop their innate talents, or whether you're drawing them in a direct direction and thereby imposing on them what you think should be. It's a bit like leaning over the shoulder of the. I remember when I did a sort of sketching class once, and the teacher looked over my shoulder and said, that's not too bad. And I thought, well, I don't know. I mean, I want you to tell me, is it good or isn't it good? I don't care about whether what I think. It's what you think. You're the instructor, and leaving space for people to do. So I don't think I suspect there's an area of doubt and confusion in my own mind about what exactly I do as a teacher.
Yeah, and there's a book that I use by Parker Palmer, and I draw on in my research, called The Courage. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, called The Courage to Teach. And he says there at the very beginning of the book, to your point, that good teachers are ones that have these kind of doubts and uncertainties and kind of are their heart is kind of broken sometimes when things don't go the way that they expected it to go, and they have they question themselves, and they kind of care about being good, and but not in the sense of what we were talking earlier about producing students who can ace standardized kind of do well on standardized tests, but um, helping students learn and develop things that they didn't know before, and kind of become good human beings in that sense of good teaching.
And that sounds to me like, again, another one of the problems for all teachers is that the mysterious quality that somehow you can affect teachers. I mean, students might say to you, I remember your classes. Absolutely. I remember this wonderful lesson you did, and it stays with me forever. And I'm very flattered. Thank you very much. That's delightful. And yet you can't really remember what it is you did that day. I mean, it seemed like a standard sort of lesson, but I said something that impressed you, or did something in a way, or there was a mysterious performance quality which you can't entirely pin down.
Yeah, that's often the case. That I have the same kind of reaction sometimes from students that, but I can't remember because going back to the Palmer that I just cited in his book, The Courage to Teach, that it's not so much what he says in that book. It's not so much of having a certain technique, because different good teachers have different techniques. Some are more teacher directed. Some are more. Some use more lectures. So there's different ways of being a good, but it's about being present in that lesson and in the moment of teaching, and kind of the encounter, the kind of dialogue that you have with the students that's really can be really impactful.
I remember when I first started teaching, a piece of advice I thought I was given, I'm not sure whether I was, but it was something along the lines of, above all, you be yourself. And I thought, well, on the one hand, I want to be myself, and I don't want to be. I want to perform, and I can't be myself. It's got to be a persona. Do your students ever say, well, to you, well, what is this good lesson like? How should I be in class?
Not so much with me, because I teach more of the foundations, the theoretical courses, or the research course. I don't teach the methods courses so much. But what I would say, what you said a minute ago was interesting about that you feel like you're performing. It's true. I do too. When in some sense you're performing when you're standing up. Every teacher in front of a class is performing. There's a performative aspect to teaching, because you want to kind of you want to be able to get your students' attention. You want them to kind of take you seriously. You want them to kind of listen to you. But I think that when you're performing as John Gibbs, or I'm performing as we're performing differently. You're performing as John, right? You as I say to kind of, here's something that I say to my students that speaks directly to your point, and it works perfectly in the UK because it rains a lot there. You may
Yes.
You may, as a teacher, you may forget your umbrella when you come to teach one day. That happens. You forgot when it's raining. But you don't forget yourself when you go to teach. You bring that self to your class. So when you're saying I perform, I respond, yes, you're performing, but you're performing yourself. You're performing as John Gibbs. You're not performing as Mordecai Gordon. I'm performing as Mordecai Gordon, and I'm not performing as somebody else. I think you're right. Part of what new teachers need to do in the first years of teaching is what I call cultivating their unique teaching persona, which is different for each individual. Cultivating your teaching persona. So, and by the way, it took me. I'm kind of. Some people are natural, but it took me like 2 decades to kind of cultivate a good. It's not. It's not necessarily immediate because sometimes people give you advice and they say that doesn't work for you. They say you gotta be strict with the students, and you gotta do this, and you gotta don't smile. Here they even joke, don't smile until Christmas, don't smile.
Yes.
Those kinds of but you really have to figure out, each teacher has to figure out what works for him or her. And that's what I call cultivating your own teaching persona.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely recognize the truth of what you're saying there in the failed attempt in my early career to be like a teacher I thought had it all. Right. The teacher whose classes you do go in, and they seem to be concentrating with a tremendous silence and also enjoying the lessons, and the kids say, "Oh, he's a wonderful teacher," and I'll just do what he does.
Right.
Well, it never really worked. Of course,
No.
I couldn't do it. It was a mysterious something.
Right, because you're different from that person that you thought had it all, and you can't just. And I failed in the same way. I tried to be somebody that wasn't me. So it takes time to kind of develop and hone that persona.
Yeah. I know one of the things you've written, and again, I haven't read this, but I was intrigued by the title, so we'll go with that. And that is Humour, Laughter, and Human Flourishing. It struck the beauty of being able to get the students to enjoy the thing, as well as learn from it, appreciate, pass the test, whatever. But and often that can just be a joke, or it can be seeing the absurdity in things. Well, I used to teach history, so seeing the absurdity in history is often a great avenue of way of teaching. So in that piece of writing you did, Humour, Laughter, and Human Flourishing, was that something you see as a part of teaching, or as part of life generally?
It's part of life generally. It's part of it's part of life, but it's also part of teaching, because and I'm not original here. I'm not the. It's one of the most famous, perhaps the most famous American educators, John Dewey, in his book Democracy in Education. There's a chapter there on work and play, so that we should, this idea that play is opposite to work is not really true. That, in other words, that bringing it to our context of teaching, learning can be fun. Learning learning doesn't have to be only this kind of dead serious, stern kind of. There, you can have laughter and humor, as long as you also have the serious stuff, or you use the laughter in a way to kind of enhance the learning experience of your students. So that's what I'm. So yeah, and that was a phase in my research kind of that I became interested in humor and laughter, and it actually related to your context. It started when I took years ago. I took my daughter, who was I think a teenager, 14 or something at that time, to London, and we went to see like 5 or 7 theater performances in 5 days, and most of them were comedies, and that kind of reminded me of how much I appreciate that kind of medium of humor. So then I came back home to the States, and I started doing some research, reading up on it, and I noticed that because my expertise is philosophy of education, and I noticed that there hadn't been at that time much work done on, this was probably close to 15 years ago, 14. There hadn't been that much work done on humor and philosophy of education. So I started doing my own research and reading and I eventually wrote an article that called Learning to Laugh at Ourselves, and published an article in the top educational philosophy journal in the US.
I think we all recognise the power of laughter in communication and teaching and fixing things in people's memories. Certainly I remember teachers who made me laugh at school or were good-humoured, and they stood out in my memory. Getting students to laugh is certainly getting them on your side, and yet laughter in education, I doubt it's measured or measurable. Well, it'd be great if it was. And that seems like a good place to stop for the Teachers Talk Radio news. Join us again in a few minutes with my guest, Professor Mordecai Gordon.
Teaching is a rewarding profession, but it comes with its fair share of challenges. That's where ADAPT come in. We're not your typical trade union, but instead a modern, apolitical alternative, offering expert legal, employment and mental health support. Protection without the politics. So what makes ADAPT different? We're always apolitical and independent, specialised solely in supporting individual teachers. Our caseworkers are professionally qualified, ensuring you always get the best advice. Plus, there's 24/7 mental health support. Whether it's a simple contract check or handling serious allegations, ADAPT are here for you. Join the thousands of educators who've chosen ADAPT to protect their careers. Subscribe at adapt.org.uk today. ADAPT. Supporting school staff. Protecting careers.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is considering significant reform of A-levels in England, which, according to the BBC, could see the introduction of what it calls a new British baccalaureate. The PM's plans could include the compulsory study of maths and English up to the age of 18, as reported in the Daily Telegraph. It's not the first time Mr Sunak has considered a shake-up, having previously said during an unsuccessful leadership campaign last year that he wanted all young people to study maths to 18. Foreign Office Minister Andrew Mitchell told BBC Radio 4 that he expects Mr Sunak to agree to reform of the education system, and said the government will be guided by the best expertise on how we ratchet up standards. Concern about any proposed changes have already been raised by unions and other post-16 professional associations, particularly around the existing issues of recruitment, retention and concerns around workload. A spokesperson for the Sixth Form Colleges Association said the post-16 curriculum was narrow by international standards, and this was partly reflective of chronic underinvestment in sixth form education since 2010. The BBC also features an article on the fall in numbers of students being accepted into universities in the UK, the first fall in 5 years. Applications also fell after demand rose during the pandemic. Fewer students got into their first choice of university this year, but more qualified for their second choice or accepted places through clearing. The new data from UCAS shows 270,350 UK 18-year-olds were accepted onto a course this year, down from 275,390 in 2022. UCAS says the figures show a return to normal growth following the surge of demand seen during the pandemic. Data for individual universities is not yet available. Last week on Teachers Talk Radio News, we featured reaction to the latest data published on suspensions and exclusions. In a linked story, Schools Week has published further analysis, this time focusing on data from schools linked to incoming Ofsted Chief Inspector Sir Martin Oliver. The analysis reported in the article suggests the Outwood Grange Academy's Trust secondaries excluded twice as many pupils as other schools in some of their regions. At a pre-appointment hearing before the Education Committee last month, Sir Martin was challenged by MPs over the Trust's high suspension rates. Sir Martin responded, "Our figures for permanent exclusions are lower than most in the areas in which we work." Schools Week says the data for the Trust's 13 secondary schools in Yorkshire and Humber had a 0.31 exclusion rate, the equivalent of 3 in every 1,000 pupils, compared to 0.17 across the region's other secondaries. In the North East, the Trust's 7 secondaries had a rate of 0.64 compared to 0.3 in others. Kim Johnson, the only committee MP to vote against the appointment of Sir Martin, said he should be brought back to answer for his words. Frank Norris, an education advisor for the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, said the original comments could be viewed as misleading. A Trust spokesperson told Schools Week that Sir Martin was comparing exclusion rates between some individual Outwood schools to some of the other schools in the same local authorities with similar profiles. The spokesperson also added that the schools had been underperforming for years and had now been transformed by the Trust. More details of the Schools Week analysis and full commentary can be found online. In Ireland, the Irish Independent reports on what it calls radical changes in how students are assessed as being on the way in a move to combat the threat of AI platforms such as ChatGPT. Higher education colleges are already being told to abandon certain forms of assessment because they are no longer sufficiently robust to award scores which count towards official grades. These include do-at-home assignments or essays, unsupervised online assessments, and multiple choice quizzes which are conducted online. There will be greater reliance on oral assessments to check understanding and systems to identify if students have cheated by using AI. However, colleges are being told to resist any temptation to switch back to traditional end-of-semester formal exams. Instead, they should consider short-term reweighting of assessments whilst they formulate a long-term plan. Finally, this week saw Education Secretary Gillian Keegan comment in the House of Commons that children she had visited in schools affected by poor quality concrete, known as RAC, had been petitioning me to stay in the porter cabin because they preferred it to the actual classroom. Ms. Keegan's comments were met with derision by many, saying it showed a chronic lack of understanding of the poor quality facilities schools had been using for many years, particularly since the cancellation of the project to rebuild many schools. However, Downing Street defended the comments, saying it reflected a conversation with children and that the department and leaders had worked hard to make sure children had been unaffected by the current challenge. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Welcome to the Friday morning break with John Gibbs. My guest this week, Professor Mordecai Gordon, author, lecturer and teacher of education at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, USA. We're discussing why teachers should not be afraid of uncertainty. Before the break, we were talking about your paper or your article on learning to laugh at ourselves. And it seems to me, not only is this highly applicable to as a tool for teaching and learning, that humour is very welcome in any of those environments, but also it's something that's quite important about the age we're living in. Surprisingly, there's more serious intensity in which you'd hope that irony and satire would be a useful antidote to that. But it's clear that people like Trump, for instance, or Putin, and the rise of nationalism and entrenched sort of views about things that people obtain in that echo chamber of the internet, that there's an increasing humorlessness, I would say, about the world we live in, to which laughter might be an important antidote as well as educational tool.
Yeah, maybe we take ourselves more seriously today than in the past. Yeah, and there's also, I think, at least here in the States, but I probably believe it's in other places as well, in Israel, there's a lot of polarization now, exacerbated by social media, and people using their social media platforms to kind of chastise others, and also not interacting with people who think different. So yeah, we're not. We don't get the benefit of as we should of humor, because humor. One of the things that humor does is it asks you to kind of think outside the box, and engage with perspectives that could be absurd or kind of ironical, cynical, and so forth.
The who'd have thought? I mean, if someone could have said to me before the internet ever appeared, I can remember when the internet, I remember teachers first showing me this thing slowly appearing on a screen and we all going, ooh. But before the internet, if someone described it to me, I would have assumed that the natural consequence of that would be open-mindedness and a far greater sense of uncertainty and not polarization. That people wouldn't echo chamber back their own ideas to themselves and so on. Now, that comes as a real surprise, and I think a particular challenge to teachers in this world in which students have so much available information and yet can easily find themselves retreating into areas of certainty.
Yeah, I mean, it is a challenge, because part of, teachers can only do so much and have relatively little within their control, because education is much broader than schooling and what happens in classrooms, and education happens everywhere, and students maybe get a lot more of their ideas and information from friends, from peer groups, from interacting with social media, as we just mentioned, from the home. So teachers have a relatively limited amount of, but yet important, ability to influence students, or let's say open-mindedness, capacity to be more open-minded, because they're only one of many influences that students and people in general are being exposed to on a daily. So we need to recognize that our abilities are kind of limited in a sense, although there are things that we can do, but for example, in my last book, I end the book with a chapter on education for open-mindedness, and because the book itself is an argument, a philosophical argument against canceling, and thinking about the educational risks and dangers of canceling people, canceling ideas, and so forth, canceling things that we don't like. But the last chapter is about education for open-mindedness, and my analysis of the research suggests that there is some things that we can do. It is limited, but sometimes things like, for let's say high school students, or media, what's called here in the United media literacy, teaching them about, to question some of the biases that media has exposed, and their own biases can have some impact about what we've been talking about, being more open-minded, being willing to listen to different some opinions that contradict your own, etc.
Do you find that the climate of open-mindedness isn't as great as you might have imagined it would be these days? I mean, not only I was talking with, we were mentioning Sharon Fraser Burgess and her ideas of how do you deal with difficult things like race in American schools? Well, you think we teach it, you explore it, you teach it, you discuss it. That what's the controversy with dealing with race? But of course, things like critical race theory are a hot button, and people are going to find that that's you're challenging the fundamentals of what it is to be American, or something of that kind, or teaching the British Empire can similarly take you in directions like that in this country. Do you find that the mood has made it more difficult to teach critical thinking and open-mindedness?
I don't know if it's more difficult for me per se, but I think it is difficult because, in part, because it's not just a matter of teaching students facts and kind of ideas that they're not aware of. There's in the United States, there's a big resistance now to any kind of diversity training, you mentioned critical race theory, uh, and there's a lot of misinformation that is kind of spread about where it's happening, and so that goes to the polarization that I mentioned before. So there, part of the challenge is that there's half of the United States, or a major part of the political establishment in the United States on the right, is really resistant to any of this, and kind of hostile. The resistant even is not even a strong enough word. They're openly hostile to this. So that there's book bannings, there's teachers that have been fired for or suspended for teaching books or ideas that in some states, because in the United States it's a there's states that are more liberal, as you know, and there's states that are very conservative. So especially in the conservative states, there's been part of the issue is getting over the kind of hostility, which is very difficult, towards these kinds of more progressive ideas, especially when they're not being represented in an accurate kind of in a fair and accurate way. So that's the challenge that we're facing.
Yes, really, and again, a surprise. Who would have thought? I mean, I can remember from history, you're studying the sort of Scopes monkey trial or something. Oh yes, in the past, people were in American schools. They found it very difficult. To think that would be a feature now, that there would be teachers in certain parts of America who will say, "Oh, you can't teach that particular textbook," or this idea is steer clear of this idea. That seems to be a trend that is very surprising.
It's surprising and it's not surprising, because I think if you look at the history of education or the history of the United States, there's always been resistance to change. In the previous century, during the civil rights era, there was a lot of resistance, and even before that, obviously, with slavery and the Jim Crow. So any kind of movement towards more open-mindedness, more diversity is always going to encounter some resistance and hostility. As I think it was James Baldwin said something along the lines of, power never gives way without a fight. So I'm paraphrasing, I'm paraphrasing him rather than quoting directly. But yeah, so there's always going to be a struggle. Because the people that feel threatened by change in the United States, it's white males, typically in power position and with conservative values, are not going to kind of easily let go of the power that they think is theirs. But that's something that is not new. It's always kind of been this way.
And schools are at the forefront of this because change is, schools, I think I've said in a previous podcast, apologies to listeners to this, but schools are forward-looking and backward-looking. I mean, people expect them to inculcate students with the values that they want students to have, tolerance or fair play or democracy or something, and at the same time be innovative and exploratory and challenge ideas. And in a sense, there's a sort of tension between the two. And so if you go into school and you say, well, this is we live in a changing time, and that's going to be reflected in the way we teach, that's bound to offend someone.
No, I think you're absolutely right, John. There's the tension between the change, the wanting to change, and on the other hand, the need to kind of preserve certain traditional values and certain ways of doing things, and kind of helping students learn the ways of the traditional traditions, the knowledge that comes from the past. So education is always kind of in some ways trying to negotiate that balance of backward looking and forward look, what you call backward looking, forward looking, and so all at the same time, it's how do we kind of negotiate the different pressures within it, because education does not happen in a bubble. It's situated in a society and a culture, and so culture. So right now, with the polarized culture that we exist in the United States, education is also kind of not cannot separate itself from that polarized society that we inhabit.
I know that looking at the things you've written, that you have an interest in the writings of Hannah Arendt, the famous philosopher and writer, famous for the banality of evil and so on. But her writing does address this question in a way, how you inculcate ideas and values that allow people to embrace the things you want them to preserve, and at the same time challenge ideas of the past. It's a really difficult problem. So I wonder if you take an interest in Hannah Arendt, and I wonder if you think her ideas are relevant to this problem.
Yeah, I do. And I'm very much influenced by her ideas. And she again says something that pertains to your point about backward looking and forward. She says in her essay, The Crisis of Education, and other places, that in education we need to be conservative for the sake of the new, for the sake of innovation. So we need to, in other words, in education, we can't just let go of and neglect the past or any tradition. We need to kind of and we need to kind of teach students about it, but not for its own sake, but for the sake of that students, for the purpose that students will take the values from the past and innovate and create new ideas. So I think that's a very powerful statement that tries to kind of bridge the gap between the old and the new in a way that's different from some other thinkers. Because she's not arguing that as some traditional thinkers have said, that students just need to know the past for its own, but students have to be taught about traditions, the past, ideas, literature, so that they can take these and innovate and preserving students' ability to be innovators, which is very important. She also says that hope, and I think that's true as well, our hope is always with the new generation. Because you and I, hate to say it, we're kind of we're set in our ways more or less, and we bring a lot of baggage, or people from our generation. I don't mean that personally. I mean,
Absolutely true.
but what's good about children is that they don't have the kind of baggage that we carry with us, and so they're more open to kind of new ideas and thinking about how do we maintain democracy in new ways, given what we have today with social media and whatever, all that. But that's a topic for probably another podcast.
Professor Mordecai Gordon, thank you so much for that. I've enjoyed the discussion a lot. I feel I want to go back and read more about Hannah Arendt and her ideas on education. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it, and good luck. Please send me a link once it goes, so I can. Although I hate to hear my own voice usually, but as a lot of people probably do. But I've really enjoyed it, and it's been fun. Thank you.
Thank you. And that brings to an end another episode of the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs. My guest this week, Professor Mordecai Gordon of Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, USA. Professor Gordon writes and teaches a course on the philosophy of education. And this week we discussed the ideas of Hannah Arendt, the necessity for students to be taught critical thinking, particularly in the context of a world of increasing certainty and fervency. And overall, possibly we should all evaluate our views and wonder whether we're a little too certain a lot of the time. Uncertainty and doubt and not knowing is as important as knowing and certainty. And that may be one of the greatest gifts we can give students, the ability to think critically, analytically, and with a high degree of uncertainty. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion, and you can hear it again as a podcast, or find it on Spotify, Teachers Talk Radio, and many other platforms. If you wish to know more about the works and writings of Professor Mordecai Gordon, you can find an extensive list of his books, papers, and pamphlets online. Thank you.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.